I did see that piece. I find it hard to believe that Trump didn't understand we had a munitions problem. General Dan Kane, who's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of
That's
Staff,
right.
And who I believe has been a reasonable voice on this whole issue since the weeks before February 28th, was warning Trump that we had a limited number of munitions and that we had to be very careful about getting into a protracted war with the Iranians. And then we got into this 40-day air war. And one of the reasons that we ended the 40-day air war was not simply because we were not winning it, it's because we were running out of munitions. It's hard to believe that Trump didn't understand this, especially when you marry it to the fact that this is what Kane was telling him all along. I think what's going on here is that Trump is trying to blame Hegseth for the mess that we're in now. Of course, what Hegseth did was he blamed his deputy. He said that his deputy had not kept him informed and had not taken the necessary steps to rectify this situation. So I think what you're going to see moving forward is a giant blame game. And most interestingly, Tom and Vali, it will be very interesting to see how Trump and Netanyahu, or more generally, the United States and the Israelis, deal with each other moving forward. Because it's very clear that the Israelis led the United States into this disaster.
Yeah, and we should also stress that Ukraine is running out of air defenses, which means they're exposed to Russia's long-range attacks. Vali, your response to John there?
No, I agree. I think, if you thought that the cardinal mistake that Trump made was to say that this war will be only 3-4 days, which is also what Israel and Bibi Netanyahu told it. I mean, just a few days ago, Israel fired 2 senior intelligence officials on the fact that they got the regime change business in Iran wrong. So the blame game is also going down in Israel as well.
Wow.
But they sold this bill of goods to Trump that, you kill Khamenei, you do the bombing, the people will rise up. There could be a Kurdish incursion from Iraq into Iran, but all said this is going to be very short. Supposedly Trump was told about that they can close the Strait of Hormuz, and he said they won't have time to do it. They'll be gone by then, right? So if you start with that kind of a very simplistic view, then everything else follows. In other words, in the first 20 days of the war, the United States hit Iran with over 300 Tomahawk missiles. And the Pentagon had only budgeted 67 for the next fiscal year. Pete Hegseth bragged that we've hit 7,000 targets. I mean, 7,000 targets with extremely sophisticated, expensive, not easy to replace, missiles and bombs. And obviously to no effect. In other words, it didn't knock Iran out of the war. And every time Trump's instinct and Bibi's instinct is one more push, one more punch, and it will do the job. So let's go to another month of bombing. Let's do it one more time. That was even the logic behind Israel's going from the 12-day war to the 40-day war. They didn't get it done in June of that year. They didn't learn the lesson. They just said one more push will do it. So I think, Trump has, and I think it's not just this war, because if you're China or Russia and you're looking at the fact that the United States, with all its military might, really cannot run a long war. It doesn't have the industrial capacity or to basically reproduce expensive weapons very rapidly. And the Iranians have discovered ways in which you can deplete those munitions through perseverance, using your geography, swarming targets with cheap drones and missiles. And I think that, in a way, even the consequences of this war for the United States in Asia, in Ukraine, elsewhere, is going to be a bit more long-lasting than just whether he accepts the MOU or not.
Yes, and this point has not been lost on Moscow and Beijing. This has been reported in the press this week. John, going back to February 28, and as you say, last year during the June 12-day war, chief among President Trump's reasons for launching this war was preventing Iran from building a nuclear weapon. He and his supporters would say that the conflict has stopped Iran's nuclear program. Is that true?
Tom, I want to make one quick point before I answer your question.
Yeah.
Just going back to why the 12-day war ended, I remember very well that two reasons were given. One is that the Israelis and the Americans were running out of defensive munitions to protect Israel against attacks from Iran. In other words, Iran's ballistic missiles and drones were beginning to overwhelm the defenses that the United States and Israel had in place during the 12-day war. So that was one reason we quit. The other reason we quit, and there were news reports about this, is that Trump was getting evidence or getting inklings that the Iranians were going to shut down the Strait of Hormuz. It's very important to understand that. So the threat of the Iranians shutting down the Strait of Hormuz was there during the 12-day war.
Well, why didn't he follow that? Why didn't he follow that logic in the lead up to February 28th this year?
Who knows? I mean, you want to remember that in the decision-making process that led to the attack on February 28th, J.D. Vance, John Ratcliffe, who's the head of the CIA, Dan Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Marco Rubio all told them that attacking Iran on February 28th would be a very bad idea.
This is documented, by the way, in the book Regime Change by those New York Times journalists. Go on, John.
Yeah, and it's quite apparent that the two key individuals who convinced Trump to launch this cockamamie war was number one, Benjamin Netanyahu, and number two, David Barnea, who was then the head of Mossad. And they told Trump that, a shock and awe campaign that had a decapitation strategy built into it would put an end to the regime in a couple days and we'd live happily ever after. This, of course, is ludicrous. And his principal advisors all understood that. But nevertheless, Trump decided that he would listen to Bibi Netanyahu and David Barnea.
Yeah, but Trump would say, getting back to my question, John, that he has stopped Iran's nuclear program. Is that true?
Well, that's the argument that they're going to make now. Remember I said at the top of the show, what's happening here is that the nuclear issue has more or less disappeared.
Exactly.
It's really quite remarkable.
It is, yeah.
Well, the nuclear issue has not disappeared at all. And after everything that's happened, and remember our emphasis on the lack of trust that exists in the present situation, the Iranians have a greater incentive than ever to acquire nuclear weapons. And the idea that they don't have the capability now to do that is not a serious argument. They can easily, in my opinion, reconstitute their nuclear program. They still have all that enriched uranium, enriched up to 60%, and it's easy to go from 60% to 90%. They could develop a bomb with relative ease. Okay. This is why we wanted to get rid of their nuclear enrichment program, which we have not done.
So the unintended consequence of this debacle is that Tehran really does have powerful incentives to develop nuclear weapons so that this sort of thing doesn't happen again. Vali, your thoughts on that? And also just generally, how long would it take for Iran to rebuild?
Well, that's now an intelligence guesstimate because we really don't know how much was destroyed, how easily can basically they rebuild their cascades and reconstitute the program. But I think we're not talking about a very long time. We were talking maybe a clock of 2 to maximum 5 years for them to not just be able to enrich and have fissile materials, but actually even to weaponize it and have sufficient number of warheads that would give them deterrence. But now we're in a position that they may not do that, provided the United States is willing to pay a very high price. In other words, if out of this current MOU, you're going to get the United States to agree to a longer ceasefire with Iran, move its troops out, potentially pay reparations, etc. Now, the only things that will make the Iranians listen is the U.S. giving them things, not demanding things. I mean, I think the period that you can basically pressure Iran into submission, even on technicalities of the nuclear issue, I think is gone. I think now the U.S. essentially will be asking them, what do you want to make this a non-issue, even if they were to accept it. And so we're seeing in these demands that Iran is now very comfortable demanding, and the United States is not comfortable demanding. So I think psychologically, Washington hasn't got there, not just the White House, the political class in Washington, a lot of the journalists. I mean, this word that they continuously overuse, Iran is overplaying its hands. It's just more like what it means to me is that we cannot believe how much this picture has changed. There must be something unreal about this. But in reality, Iran is not overplaying its hands. It's just playing its hand.
Yeah, but Vali, I've put this question to John in past programs with other guests. Let me put this to you. Whether it's the IRGC, the so-called hardliners, or the so-called moderates who support the president and the parliamentary speaker and their chief negotiator, shouldn't they be concerned about the economic toll that Iran is suffering from the war? I mean, you've got this US blockade of the Iranian ports that's delaying Iran's economic recovery. So I'd put the question to you, given that, isn't Iran overplaying its hands?
Well, first of all, let me say, I don't believe in this moderates versus hardliners. I think there is more division in Washington than there is in Tehran.
Right. Okay.
And Rubio, Vance and the dysfunctionality of decision-making in Washington is a lot more than Tehran. Every government ultimately has a debate over policy. But I think there is a consensus in Iran that they will not give up the Strait. There is a consensus that they have managed the war very, very well. There is a consensus that they have defeated the superpower, or at least put it on its heels. What is there for them to debate about? Even this argument that now has become very popular in Washington, I think a lot of it is really disinformation that Mojtaba Khamenei is dead or he's not really in charge. What difference does it make? Whoever is in charge is running a tight ship. I mean, we're asking the wrong question here. So what if he's dead or alive? Doesn't make a difference. So no, I don't think they see themselves overplaying their hand. They think they have a narrow window to get the maximum amount of strategic advantage from having turned the table on the US. It would be unconscionable if they didn't press their advantage. The future generations, they think, will ask them, you had the US on its back heel. This was the time for you to ask for more. And they would say that the US has put blockade in Iran now twice, and the US is the first to blink. They can suffer more than everybody else can. After 47 years of suffering, they can suffer more. And they ultimately think that the only way to a better place is through the path they're going. Now, I'm not going to sort of second guess whether they're overplaying their hand or not, but I think a country that in the past 6 months has managed to survive 2 nuclear-powered militaries going after it, the world's premier superpower, Middle East's most armed and technologically advanced military, and yet we're having this discussion. I think in humility, we have to think that maybe they've got it right. And actually the society, and I don't mean put it only on Trump, everybody else in Washington who's thought that the Iran policy and the way we've gone about it has been correct all along, that Israel is correct, that, that they obviously have got it wrong. So far, they've got it wrong. And ultimately, on the economic issue, Iran is suffering. But John said at the very beginning, they're asking for big economic gives. You have to pay for war reparations. You have to unfreeze up to $30 billion. Iran has reportedly up to $100 billion of frozen assets around the world. We want to trade and we want to sell oil to whoever we want, and you need to get out of the way. And once you lift the sanctions, we will be able to actually collect tolls more easily because we can actually receive the money. So short-term pain, long-term gain. That's the way they're seeing it.